people are doing. So I finally managed to make the iPhone's comparison. I know it took a while, but hey, delays happen. Regardless, here's the thing. I completely understand if you might be thinking, well, it's the iPhone. It's usually boring. There's nothing quite special about it most of the time. Usually, if anything at all, you might get some recycled features. I understand. I felt that before. But in this case, I think it's gonna be slightly more interesting at the very least. If not, it could quite easily sway you towards it because the cameras they're quite something. That's all I'm gonna say. The rest of it you're gonna have to see for yourself. So hopping right in, here's the thing. Vivo provides us with three very different color profiles. We have the vivid colors, we have Zeiss's natural colors, and then we have the textured mode. All three of them are geared towards very different and very unique styles of photography. That's great. But what the iPhone does, I think this is like a world's first because they are going to give you complete and absolute granular control over the photographic style that you want. That's massive. You know, the fact that the iPhone is giving you more options in terms of the type of photographs that you can have, more options for the consumer, that's wild. That is absolute brutal insanity. And the absolute best part about the iPhone is that the natural color profile, it really suits my particular taste because it gives us, as the name would suggest, natural colors, but it also gives us a very good amount of contrast, which is a stunning, beautiful thing as you might expect, because in most iPhones that I've used previously, the contrast has always been lacking. I would recommend every single person on this planet that has any hope or any reason to buy the iPhone, the new iPhone 16s that is, go into photographic styles and just fine-tune it. Just take a few photos, test it out, and just see exactly what kind of photos you prefer because you can go so far with it. Now, it's not related to the comparison, but I should also mention that if you have not had a milk cake before, you're missing out on life. Now, having said all that, there is a little issue that I've noticed on the iPhone, and it's been something that has bothered me throughout the ages. By ages, I mean like the last 3 generations, more or less. It's the white balance. It always neutralizes your shots, which, see, I've been very clear about this. I don't like it when smartphones just suddenly decide that neutral colors is the way to go. It's not. I'd much rather the color tones be preserved, like the X100 Ultra does every single time. Zeiss's natural colors is something that it's gonna get as close to reality as you could possibly expect from any smartphone that I've ever used thus far. It really is that good. The iPhone, on the other hand, any kind of warmth that you have in the scene, more often than not, it'll just remove it entirely. Especially if you're like shooting some kind of sunset. I don't have the images here, but yeah, that's usually gonna be not as nice as you might expect. But then the textured mode on the X100 Ultra, I see this is another interesting feature to have. It's quite an intriguing one, to be honest, but it's not particularly fine-tuned, I guess, because it will overdo the contrast a lot of the times. It can't handle dynamic range, but when you shoot in flat conditions, like these photos right here, it can actually turn out stunning. Especially close-ups look insane with that high contrast and just the punch and the vibrance it gives you. Oof, it's beautiful stuff. And now finally for the dynamic range situation. You see, on the iPhone, we have really good highlight preservation and the gradient is beautiful, but it can tend to crush shadows a little. You might be thinking, well, that could be because I'm using the natural color profile, which boosts contrast. But that's not entirely the case. Crushing shadows is very different because, as you can see here, it's not crushing shadows in this particular shot. It's doing a very good job. It's about as good as the Vivo. It's not focusing on the flowers properly. Obviously, I should have noticed that before, but regardless, the shadows are really well preserved here. The Vivo has a completely different problem with the highlights, you see. It tends to have this weird look with the highlights. There's no smooth gradient that I would expect from something like the Vivo because it's supposed to have really good dynamic range, but I don't know, it really doesn't look nice. And then we have the ultrawide camera. You see, it's basically as you would expect. I would always recommend using the Zeiss's natural colors on the X100 Ultra because it gives you some of the most beautiful and natural looking color tones. The iPhone, on the other hand, I think it goes for a more stylistic approach, or rather I go for a more stylistic approach because I'm using the natural color profile. You can, as I mentioned before, use whatever the hell you want. That's the beauty of this. It really still manages to blow my mind, even after I've used the phone for like a week and a half. The fact that the iPhone is giving me more options than the X100 Ultra, at least in terms of how I want my photos to look, that's quite something. That's not to say that the crushing shadows problem doesn't exist. It's, I think, a little bit more problematic with the ultrawide camera because, as you can see, there are certain situations where it'll just unnaturally crush shadows even though it's not really a problematic situation. But then for a significantly more challenging shot, it's actually doing a really good job. It's not as good in terms of dynamic range as the X100 Ultra, only in terms of the ultrawide camera, but it's still manageable. Now don't get me wrong, saying manageable doesn't mean that it's good or it's even acceptable. The iPhone is supposed to be near perfect in these basic situations because even though, yeah, it does give you a lot of options now in terms of the type of photography you want, every other option is kind of limited, so it should nail the basics, right? Now speaking of basics, obviously we have the macro photography side of things. So here's the interesting thing. The iPhone with the ultrawide camera can get insanely close, as you can tell. The Vivo, it doesn't even look like a macro photo because of just how much closer the iPhone can get. But the X100 Ultra has a massive trick up its sleeve. It can utilize the telephoto camera for not just taking telephoto macro shots, which I think are arguably, well, not really, objectively better in my personal opinion at least, because you get insane depth of field, no distortion, no shadow like we're getting on the iPhone. It just looks so much better. But it can also utilize a whole another layer of sensor crop, which basically puts it on par in terms of just how close you can get to the subject, that is. And so I would say that alone, in my books at least, gives the Vivo an edge on the macro side of things. And then of course we have the 2x. Now here's the thing, the X100 Ultra by far has some of the highest quality zoom capabilities that I've seen. You might be thinking, well, there are so many other smartphones out there with dual telephoto cameras. How's the X100 so good? It's software processing and the sensor quality that it has. A singular 3.7x sensor is insane that we have. We'll get to that, but the 2x is also just stunning. And cropping into 500%, yes, the iPhone is not bad. But damn, that X100 Ultra's quality is something else. Just the amount of grain that it is reducing as opposed to the iPhone, and also the fact that it is giving us more detail and less sharpening than the iPhone, it's quite something. In my books at least, that's a win. Honestly, it doesn't surprise me that the X100 Ultra is doing a better job because its detail preservation is quite possibly by far the absolute best I've seen. And at 3.7x, the X100 Ultra will obviously do a better job. There's no doubt about that. The iPhone doesn't really have that optical zoom, right? But what it does have is a 5x optical zoom. It's supposed to be a really high quality sensor, right? But the X100 Ultra, as I mentioned previously, it is so damn good and it has such an insanely high quality sensor that it just breezes through this stuff. Case in point right here. I mean, just take a look at the amount of detail that is being preserved. And most importantly, the amount of grain and artifacting that you can see on the iPhone, which is using optical zoom, by the way. It's supposed to be the other way around, but it's not. Then of course we have high resolution. So one thing I do want to point out, the white balance is just so terribly cooled off on the iPhone. It looks so unnatural. Obviously it looked like it does on the X100 Ultra. This is not even using its natural colors, so the vibrance is slightly higher, but yeah, it still looks so much more realistic as opposed to whatever is happening on the iPhone. However, cropping all the way in, I would say that it's very, very close, but I do think that the Vivo has slightly less grain, but more processing and sharpening that I can see. The iPhone is the bang opposite. It does seem to have a slight issue with grain. I do get it, this is a 500% crop, so naturally there is supposed to be some grain, and the iPhone just doesn't bother with reducing it too much to maybe cut down on processing, possibly. But then we have the ultrawide camera. Now the iPhone, it actually gives us for the very first time a high resolution ultrawide. Yeah, Samsung should be taking notes. How long have I even been complaining about the Samsung ultrawides being absolutely pathetic? I don't even remember at this point. But the fact that the iPhone is pulling ahead, yeah, that's bad. Anywho, cropping all the way in, and that's good stuff. I mean, it's keeping up with the X100 Ultra. It also appears to be just slightly sharper, but I think that's digital sharpening because I can see some small amounts of artifacting in there. However, this is still admirable considering that this is the first time that we're getting an ultra-wide high-res. It's not bad at all. So yeah, as I mentioned previously, Samsung needs to be taking notes on this. Now then, at 3.7x, so this is just the 50 megapixel shot from the X100. I say just, but we'll get to the 200 soon enough. However, at 3.7x, Naturally, the iPhone's not really going to stand much of a chance now, is it? Because it doesn't have any optical zoom, and case in point right here. However, here's the real test. The X100 Ultra's 200 megapixel 3.7x versus the 5x on the iPhone, which doesn't give you high res, which is unfortunate. But that's just the way it rolls. So cropping all the way in, I am matching the crop on both phones so that we're cropping to 500% on the iPhone, and then who knows how much I'm cropping in on the X100, I don't remember. But here's the thing, the X100 is actually pulling ahead. So considering the lighting situation and that it was in medium lighting, not particularly well lit, this is a tremendous result that we're getting. The fact that it's pulling ahead with less grain, more detail preservation, that's quite something. I think there's even just slightly less sharpening on the X100. There is sharpening, just to be clear, but it's slightly less as compared to the iPhone. Anyways, with that said, let us finally move on to selfies, the front camera. The front camera is interesting. So I have noticed one thing, the X100 produces very brightened results, and I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I also think the iPhone can darken skin tones, and it can desaturate as well. You'll see soon enough exactly what I'm talking about as we go through the photos, but yeah, the issues that we have is that the X100 is too bright, and sometimes it'll blow out highlights because it is too bright. The iPhone is basically the exact opposite, and sometimes it'll desaturate. And that fact is especially evident when you look at some backlit situations, or when there's not a whole bunch of light falling on your face, or my face in this particular case. As you can see, it looks like my skin tone is monochromatic. The X100 on the other hand, because of the way it processes the images, it can really bring out the skin tones, and it looks so much more pleasing, considering the situation that is. And then of course, selfie portraits. Now, both of these have stunning edge detection, and the selfies themselves, they're gonna end up looking basically the same as we saw with the regular selfies, which is to say, kind of brightened, sometimes blown out highlights on the X100, that's the issue there. And on the iPhone, it's the exact opposite. Sometimes it'll crush shadows, and not just shadows, it'll just underexpose in general and desaturate skin tones. Maybe even give you some yellowish skin tones, which I'm not the biggest fan of. And then in this backlit shot, I'd say both of them are completely screwing it up. I'm not really sure why, because I took this at the same time as I did the regular selfies, and there, both of them performed relatively much better. The iPhone is still looking monochromatic, even more so in this case. On the other hand, the X100 Ultra looked like it was basically taking the same shot through a prism. So yeah, there's issues there. Now, night selfies actually look kinda nice on the iPhone, especially when you're shooting in fairly well lit conditions, considering that it is night mode. If you shoot it in darker conditions, there's only one phone that can handle night mode, and that is the S24 Ultra. That's the only phone that can do it so far. The X100, even with good lighting, can't really handle it because it just goes so absolutely unfathomably overboard with the brightening. It's way too much. Then of course we have rear camera portraits. Now this is where I think the iPhone can actually improve on. You might be thinking that's very odd, because usually, hell, basically every single time, I've always been a massive fan of how nice iPhone portraits tend to look. But this time around, I'm not really sure what the reason is, but it just looks ridiculous a lot of the times. There's a lot of inconsistencies. That's the problem I have. Now I understand you might be feeling skeptical. You might be thinking that the problem that you're seeing, it's because I'm using the natural color profile or the natural photographic style, which does give you a lot of contrast. But I did get good photos as well from the iPhone, good portraits that is, so this is actually an inconsistency that we have, not related to the color profile that you choose. Having said that though, I think the X100 Ultra, the only thing that I've noticed in this particular comparison at least, where it seemed to be struggling just a pinch, is that it gave me really yellowish looking skin tones sometimes. Not always, but it's a minor little issue. I just thought I should point it out, given that I'm being fairly critical about the iPhone, right? And then finally we have the backlit portrait. Obviously, it's my comparison, it's gotta happen. And here's the thing, I think the iPhone, it looks nice, it looks very natural in terms of the way it's processing the image. You know, the fact that the sun is in the background, it's obvious that in the foreground, me as a subject, I should look dark. The X100 on the other hand, it is processing the image and it is giving us a whole bunch of details. So technically it is better, I guess, on the X100, but the natural look of the iPhone, it has some sort of appeal, for me at least. So I don't know, I kind of like how the iPhone looks, but I can completely understand why most people might actually choose the X100 here. Now then finally, night portraits. Now I get it, this isn't exactly very night mode-esque, I took this outdoors, but there was still a fair bit of light. There was this massive purple light falling right on my face. But here's the thing. I feel the iPhone managed to give us a little bit more detail, even though the X100 is the one that has a brighter shot. And now finally we have the good old-fashioned night mode. So, here's the thing. The X100 Ultra, it has a tendency to give you really bright, really processed, really, I guess, safe looking night mode shots. It means that nothing will be crushed, nothing will be blown out more often than not. On the other hand, the iPhone, it goes for a more natural approach. It kind of retains the natural look of nighttime, which I personally really like. I've always preferred the scene to look exactly as it should in real life in my photographs. So the approach that the iPhone takes more often than not does win my personal preference. That is not to say that it doesn't screw up. However, one thing that I found is that the white balance, or rather the cooling off issue that we saw with the regular daylight images, that doesn't exist with night mode. So here's the thing, the iPhone can produce proper images with accurate colors and white balance, but it chooses not to. I mean, that I take that personally, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that if you have a lot of lights in the foreground, you might end up getting some lens reflections. I mean, just take a look at the sky. It looks like there's a light show going on. Yeah, that's still a problem. I still can't believe that something like the iPhone still has such a blatant issue like that. And then on the X100, yeah, this is one of those areas where it exaggerated a lot. It doesn't happen all the time, which is a good thing, but the inconsistency doesn't leave some things to be desired, I guess. But then there is one final thing that you need to keep in mind when you are using the iPhone. Always, this is my personal recommendation for everybody on the planet, always utilize the maxed out night mode setting. You can max it out, you can save the setting via your settings, I mean the actual phone settings, not the camera settings, but without it, it just doesn't work out. With maxed out night mode, you can get just as good night mode, ultra-wide night mode shots as the X100 Ultra in most cases. And yeah, the X100 is generally brighter, that's just the way it processes night mode shots. I actually prefer how the iPhone looks in most cases. However, that's not to say that it won't crush shadows sometimes. There are certain images that I didn't manage to take where I felt like it was going a little too overboard with the contrast and the way it was handling the shadows. And so last but not least, we have zoom. Now look, here's the thing, we already know exactly how well the X100 Ultra performed with the daytime images, right? So I'm guessing that you guys already have some kind of expectation as to how it's going to perform at night. However, having said that, with the 2X at least, I'd say it's not that far off on either, which is quite surprising because with the daytime shot, the iPhone wasn't performing quite as well, it had more grain. With the nighttime, I guess the night mode processing is powerful enough to the point that it actually gives you a really nice looking shot. The X100 actually looks slightly worse because of just how much processing and sharpening it has. And then of course we have the 3.7x. I feel like this one is completely pointless because even with our cropping in, I can tell that the iPhone's not going to stack up because it doesn't have the optical zoom, naturally. Then finally, 5x. Now this is where it's going to be interesting. So, we have 5x optical zoom, very nice optical zoom on the iPhone. It does have fairly strong processing to couple with that, and it can produce some really nice looking 5x night mode shots. The amount of detail that the X100 Ultra can produce is staggeringly high, even at night. And it is blatantly higher than anything the iPhone could ever hope for because there is some processing, yes, obviously there's noise reduction and so on and so forth. I can even see noise reduction artifacts on the iPhone. But the detail level is so much, it's sky high as opposed to the iPhone. And that's the crazy part because the iPhone's the one with the optical zoom advantage. But I guess it's not really much of an advantage, is it? And so with that said, that brings us to the end of this beautiful comparison. I gotta admit, I'm still having my mind blown apart by the fact that the iPhone, previously, any of the previous iPhones that is, they did not really provide us with any realistic options in terms of color profiles. They had some rich contrast and stuff like that, but more often than not, at least it was my experience that they would mostly just crush shadows. That's all they would do. But now, with the amount of granular choices and just the fine tuning that you can do, every single person on the planet who buys the iPhone will be capable of meeting their tastes with the photographs that they take because of this particular feature. The crazy part is, it went from basically giving you no proper customization to the maximum amount to the point that it's even better than the X100 Ultra. That is insanity. I don't know if everyone can really grasp the situation here, but the amount of choices the consumer has from the iPhone, it is a world's first. At least it's a first for me, because I've never seen something like this before from any iPhone thus far. That's not to say it doesn't have problems. It does. It most definitely does. There are issues with the white balance and the cooling of images, the skin tones, the darkening of the skin, and the portrait issue that we just noticed. All that stuff, it's all there. It needs fine-tuning, sure. Apple needs to fine-tune the processing and needs to make sure that the inconsistencies, more than anything else, are dealt with. But damn, the choices, man, I love that I can at least see myself using the iPhone now because of the choices that we have. It's quite something, and something like this, customization like this, is very important to me, and I'm more than certain that it is extremely important to a lot of other people as well. So, with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and I'll see you guys soon with more. Cheers!